welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at the Tarrasch variation of the French defense. The French defense opens up with the moves pawn to e4, pawn to e6, and now to reach the Tarrasch variation there follows pawn to d4, pawn to d5, and now the signature move of the Tarrasch variation, knight to d2. Now, with the French defense, Black has immediately instigated a threat to White's central pawn on the e4 square with his move pawn to d5. And the major strategic idea here for Black is to lure White into advancing the pawn to the e5 square, whereupon the pawns will be fixed on the d4 and e5 squares, as currently the Black pawns on e6 and d5 are working as a team to fix the pawns. Once Black has succeeded in forcing White to bring the pawn to e5, his major strategic idea is to follow up with the move c7 to c5 and begin to undermine White's center before White has a chance to support the center and set up an attack which allows him to utilize his space advantage. Therefore, White's most common move is not to advance the pawn to e5 immediately, but instead, White generally finds a way to defend the pawn on the e4 square. And there are two ways of going about this. One move is the line knight to c3. But the subject of today's video is the alternative move knight to d2, another main line which is known as the Tarrasch variation. The benefit of using the d2 square as opposed to the c3 square for the knight is that White has not blocked his c-pawn, and therefore he stands a better chance of securing that important pawn on d4 because he will always have an opportunity to play the move c2 to c3 whenever it comes in handy. We'll get a chance to see this and much more today in this video. Let's take a look. The Tarrasch variation of the French defense begins with the moves pawn to e4, pawn to e6, pawn to d4, pawn to d5, and now the move knight to d2. And the idea here is simply that White has managed to protect the pawn on e4 without blocking the c-pawn so that the move c2 to c3 is available under many circumstances. For example, in one of the main lines, Black continues with the move knight to f6, putting more pressure on the e4 pawn. White plays pawn to e5, knight f to d7, bishop to d3, and now the move pawn to c5, whereupon White is now able to play the move c2 to c3. And this is a direct consequence of the fact that White has positioned his knight on the d2 square rather than on the c3 square. Backing up a bit. After the move knight to d2, an additional benefit of being able to play the move c2 to c3 is that White eliminates the option of Black bringing his bishop to the b4 square. If White opens up with the move knight to c3 on move 3, one of the important and popular options for Black is to continue with the move bishop to b4, known as the Winnower variation. And with this move, Black renews the threat of d takes e4 and also sets up the opportunity to damage White's pawn structure on the queen side with the move bishop takes c3 check. However, when White uses the move knight to d2, as in the Tarrasch variation, the move bishop to b4 is eliminated, since now bishop to b4 can be replied to with the move c2 to c3. Now, how should Black continue? Black's main idea is to lure the e-pawn to the e5 square and then follow up with the move c7 to c5. And there are a couple ways to go about achieving this c5 break. One way is to continue with the move knight to f6, when White will continue pawn to e5, knight f to d7, and now no matter which of the moves White continues with, there are a few moves here. Let's say pawn to f4 is one move, pawn to c3 is another move, and bishop to d3 is yet another move. No matter how White continues, Black will follow up with the move pawn to c5. And this is one of the main ways for Black to continue. Another option for Black after the move knight to d2 is to simply play for the move c7 to c5 straight away, with the move pawn to c5. And after this move, white is obliged to find some way to defend the d4 pawn. If white continues with the move pawn takes pawn on c5, and black replies with bishop takes c5, black has achieved immediate equality, as white no longer has any space advantage in the center, and black is developing comfortably here. Also, if white were to continue with the move c2 to c3, which would appear to be logical since white can now recapture the pawn on d4 with a pawn, black would here be able to capture twice with the move pawn takes pawn on d4, pawn takes pawn on d4, pawn takes pawn on e4, and now knight takes e4. And this leads to a position with an isolated pawn, an isolated queen's pawn on the d4 square. Now, in many chess positions, the pawn on d4 is not such a big deal, as white is given extra territory on the c file, an open line on the c file, and an open line on the e file, and extra mobility for his minor pieces. However, in this particular instance of the isolated queen's pawn position, white's position of his knight on the e4 square is a small but significant demerit in this position. Black can now continue with the simple and straightforward move knight to f6, beginning to exchange some material, or also the move bishop to b4 check, which will either exchange bishops on the d2 square or tempt white into retreating the e4 knight back to the c3 square. In both cases, black has good chances of exchanging the minor pieces off, and as exchanges happen, white's attacking chances decrease, while black's chances of organizing an attack in the long term against the d4 pawn increase. And this is particularly true if the exchanges which take place are of minor pieces. So both of the moves, pawn takes pawn on c5 and pawn to c3, are unsatisfactory for white. However, there are two options available for white which work in this position. One straightforward approach is to simply play the move pawn takes pawn on d5. And now no matter which recapture black chooses, there are some downsides. One recapture is to play queen takes pawn on d5. And now from here, white will gain some time by attacking the queen with the move bishop to c4, but only after inserting the move knight g to f3 in this position. And this is an important insertion because if white were to simply play the move bishop to c4 straight away, black would capture the pawn on g2. So instead, white continues with the move knight g to f3. And now the main line continues. Pawn takes pawn on d4, temporarily winning a pawn. Bishop to c4, attacking the queen. Queen to d6, castles kingside. Knight to f6, knight to b3, knight to c6, and now knight takes pawn on d4, knight takes pawn on d4, and knight takes pawn on d4. And in this position, white has a small initiative, as his king has already castled and black's has not. And the pieces in the center on d4 and c4 occupy more centralized and more active positions than the black counterparts in this position. However, black's position is not to be underestimated here, as black can quickly drum up some counterplay with a variety of development plans. One straightforward plan is to play queen to c7 and bishop to d6, where there's also a plan involving bishop to d7, castling queenside, and then queen to c7 and bishop to d6. Both of these methods of play are available for black, and in both cases, white appears to have good chances of a slight initiative, but black also has good chances of counterplay. Now, while the move queen takes d5 is often played, the move pawn takes d5 is played a little bit more often. With this move, black can be satisfied with the fact that he has uncaged the c8 bishop, opened up the e file, and has adequate chances for piece activity in this position. But as is so often the case in such structures, Black will always have to keep in mind that he's going to end up with an isolated pawn on the d5 square, a weakened isolated pawn on the d5 square whenever the c pawn and d pawn are traded off. This happens in the main line after the moves knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, knight to f6, castles kingside, bishop to d6, and now this is a timely moment for the move pawn takes pawn on c5. As the bishop has just moved, bishop takes c5, knight b3, and bishop to d6. This is one of the main positions which arises after Black recaptures with pawn takes pawn on d5 rather than queen takes pawn on d5. Now in this position, Black can, again, be reasonably satisfied with the fact that he has brought his knight out to a reasonable square, his bishop has potential scope, both bishops have good scope, and there are open files on the c file and the e file. However, White also has reasons to be very happy with this position, since his knights are perfectly positioned to obtain the blockading square on d4, a square which is now weakened because there's no pawn on the c file or e file which can contest this square, and White has long-term chances of sustaining an initiative based on attacking the weakened d5 pawn. Additionally, White has also managed to castle here and also has the right to move, so White has a bit of a development advantage due to the fact that he opened the game with the right to move, and he's also gained some time against the bishop, since the bishop has now moved 3 times out of the opening, and each of White's moves have helped him to progress with his strategy. Therefore, White still has good chances of a slight advantage here, but Black also has chances to be satisfied with his piece activity. So, the move e takes d5 is the main line here. Another move which is possible for White in this position is to play the move knight g to f3, simply getting on with development. And in most cases, this is simply going to transpose into e takes d5 variations, as White will generally follow up with pawn takes pawn on d5, and often he will also tend to follow up with the move bishop to b5. Now that we understand how play unfolds after the move pawn to c5, let's take a closer look at the move knight to f6. And with this move, Black delays the move c7 to c5 for a couple of moves, and first lures the e pawn up to the e5 square. Now the main line is to continue with the immediate move pawn to e5, but what happens if White instead attempts to defend the e4 pawn with a piece, say with bishop to d3? Generally, this is simply going to transpose into the main lines, as Black is still in a timely position to play the move pawn to c5, and White will generally have no option but to continue here with the immediate move pawn to e5, or to play the move pawn to e5 over the next couple of moves. So this is simply going to transpose into the main lines, where White could have simply played the move pawn to e5 immediately. And by playing the move order bishop to d3 and pawn to c5, if White continues to delay the move e4 to e5, he tends to actually give Black additional and unnecessary options as to how to reply to this position. So therefore, the move pawn to e5 is generally considered to be the most appropriate in this position. So, after the move knight to f6, White generally continues straight away with the move pawn to e5, knight f to d7 is played, and the following position is reached. White's e-pawn has made it all the way up to the e5 square, whereas Black's pawn has simply advanced 1 square to the e6 square. And this would generally be quite enough for White to have a secure advantage in this position, as he has a space advantage and plenty of attacking opportunities. However, Black relies upon the ease with which he is able to achieve the move c7 to c5 as a compensating factor and as his chances for counterplay in this position. And unlike those positions in which Black struck out with the immediate move pawn to c5, in this case, White can no longer play the move e takes d5, luring a pawn or the queen to the vulnerable d5 square, and instead White simply doesn't have access to this move, pawn takes pawn on d5. And so this is the benefit for black in playing the knight to f6 variation. Now from here, white generally plays the move bishop to d3 or pawn to c3, and it does not matter which of the move orders he chooses. After the move bishop to d3 and pawn to c5, white continues with pawn to c3. Knight to c6 is played, attacking the d4 pawn for a second time. And now, traditionally, rather than bringing the knight to the f3 square, white brings the knight to the e2 square to defend the d4 pawn. And the purpose of this is that white is leaving the f3 square available for the knight on d2. At a timely moment, white is going to further consolidate the center with the move knight d to f3. And this will also have the effect of opening up the dark squared bishop on c1. Now, black's position is seriously cramped here, and if he doesn't play accurately, he can quickly find himself at a serious disadvantage. For example, if black were to simply continue with his development with the move bishop to e7, a seemingly harmless looking move, white would have the advantage after castling kingside, knight to f3, and now by the way, white is actually very close to setting up a decisive kingside attack by the means of playing, for example, knight to f4, pawn to h4, and knight to g5. And this is just one of many attacking plans which are available for white, and this would be crushing. So black is obliged to make something happen very quickly here, and the best place to look for this opportunity is in the center with the moves pawn takes pawn on d4, pawn takes pawn on d4, and now pawn to f6. And this is a typical pawn break in both the Tarrasch variation and in the French defense as a whole. This is another way that black is able to chip away at the pawns in the center and attempt to leave white with some weaknesses. However, there's a clear downside to this operation, and in this position, white will simply continue with the move pawn takes pawn on f6, and after knight takes f6, white has a clear advantage because the pawn on e6 is backwards and very vulnerable on this location, and white has great attacking chances based on this factor. White has an excellent score in this position. In fact, white's pawns on d4 and e5 are so strong that black is typically obliged to play the moves pawn takes pawn on d4 and pawn to f6 sooner or later, even if this is going to leave him with a couple of small structural disadvantages. In fact, rather than playing the move bishop to e7, the move bishop to e7 that we just looked at, instead, the main reply for black here is to immediately play the moves pawn takes pawn on d4, pawn takes pawn on d4, pawn to f6, pawn takes pawn on f6, and knight takes pawn on f6. And now, while it's true that black still has those couple of problems, he still has a bad bishop on c8 and a weakened pawn on e6, by initiating the pawn exchanges first, before developing the dark squared bishop, black has made it possible for him to position his dark squared bishop on a more active location on the d6 square. And he does so in the main line after the moves knight to f3, bishop to d6, castles kingside. And now black has access to a couple moves here. Either the move castling kingside or queen to c7 are feasible options here. And in both cases, black has fair compensation for the structural problems that he has, and he can sometimes manage to keep white's initiative down to a minimum in these lines based on the counterplay available because of his piece activity. However, white still has a slight initiative and a slightly more convenient position here. That's all for today. I hope you've enjoyed this investigation of the main lines of the French Tarrasch variation. It appears that white gets a slight advantage in the main lines based on the structural deficiencies which black often has in these positions. However, it's also quite clear that black is able to drum up significant counterplay against the center and often is able to find comfortable locations for his pieces. Therefore, the appropriate analytical conclusion of these positions is that black has a slight disadvantage in these positions, but good chances of counterplay. That's all for today, and thank you for watching. We'll see you again soon.